March 17, 1944. Somewhere over the farmlands of western Iowa. The cold morning air carried the distant drone of machinery across fields still brown from winter. But this wasn't the sound of tractors preparing for spring planting. It was the synchronized thunder of Wright Cyclone engines as a formation of B-17 flying fortresses passed overhead on yet another training flight from the air base outside Des Moines. Most of the local farmers barely looked up anymore. The sound had become as routine as the morning rooster's crow. But on this particular morning, one man stood motionless at the edge of a cornfield, his eyes tracking the silver bombers as they cut across the pale blue sky. His name was Klaus Werner, and 6 months earlier he had been flying similar aircraft over Germany. Only his planes had different markings, different engines, and a very different mission. Werner was 24 years old, a former Unteroffizier in the Luftwaffe who had been shot down during the defense of Hamburg in July 1943. The flak burst that tore through his Messerschmitt's wing hadn't killed him, though several of his squadron mates weren't so fortunate. He'd managed to coax the crippled fighter far enough over the channel to reach English-controlled airspace before bailing out. British paratroopers found him hanging from a tree in Sussex, his ankle broken and his shoulder dislocated from the landing. What followed had been a journey he could never have imagined when he first put on his Luftwaffe uniform. Processing through British POW camps, transport across the Atlantic in the belly of a cargo ship, arrival at Ellis Island where American MPs searched him with mechanical efficiency, and finally transfer by train to Camp Clarinda in southwestern Iowa. A compound surrounded by barbed wire where several hundred German prisoners waited out the war in a landscape that looked nothing like the Europe they'd left behind. The American guards had explained the rules and broken German supplemented with emphatic hand gestures. The Geneva Convention would be observed. They would work but not on military objectives. They would receive pay, though in camp scrip rather than real currency. They would be treated as prisoners, not as enemies. This last distinction seemed important to the Americans, though Werner wasn't entirely sure what it meant in practice. His first impression of Iowa had been profound disorientation. The land stretched flat and empty in every direction, broken only by isolated farmsteads and the occasional small town. There were no bomb craters, no ruins, no evidence that a war was being fought anywhere in the world. The civilians who occasionally passed the camp in trucks or automobiles looked well-fed and unconcerned. Their clothing was intact and clean. Their vehicles had fuel. Everything Werner had been told about America being on the edge of collapse from the strain of war appeared to be propaganda of the most transparent sort. The camp itself was basic but adequate. Wooden barracks arranged in neat rows, mess halls that served food in quantities Werner hadn't seen since before the war, and recreational facilities that included a library stocked with German-language books and newspapers. The guards were neither cruel nor particularly friendly. They maintained professional distance and enforced camp regulations with bureaucratic consistency. Escape attempts were rare not because the security was impregnable, but because most prisoners couldn't imagine where they would go even if they got past the wire. Werner had expected to wait out the war in this strange limbo. He would work whatever labor details they assigned, maintain his dignity as a captured soldier, and eventually return to whatever remained of Germany once the fighting ended. This was the standard trajectory for prisoners of war. Capture, confinement, repatriation. The Geneva Convention laid it all out clearly. His duty as a German soldier was simply to survive until he could return home. But 3 weeks after his arrival, Werner's name appeared on the work detail roster for agricultural labor. He would be assigned to the Hoffmann farm, 15 miles west of the camp, to help with spring planting and general farm work. The shortage of American agricultural workers had created an opportunity for prison labor, and the War Department had approved a program allowing POWs to work on farms under minimal supervision. Werner had never worked on a farm. He'd grown up in Hamburg, the son of a machinist who worked in the shipyards. His knowledge of agriculture consisted entirely of theoretical understanding that food came from somewhere other than shops. The idea of spending his captivity doing manual labor in fields seemed vaguely humiliating, though he understood he had no choice in the matter. On April 1, 1944, a stake bed truck pulled up to the camp gate at dawn. Werner and 7 other German prisoners climbed into the back while an American guard, a corporal named Henderson who looked barely old enough to shave, settled into the cab with his rifle. They drove through the early morning darkness along dirt roads that became progressively narrower and more rutted until finally pulling up in front of a weathered 2-story farmhouse surrounded by bare fields waiting for spring. A man emerged from the house as the truck's engine died. He was in his 60s, thick through the shoulders and chest in the way of men who'd spent their lives in physical labor. His face had been carved by decades of sun and wind into deep furrows that gave him an expression of perpetual sternness. He walked with a slight limp that Werner later learned came from a farming accident that had crushed his left foot 30 years earlier. This was Albert Hoffmann, and the land stretching in every direction belonged to him and his family. 320 acres of some of the most fertile soil in Iowa, planted primarily in corn with smaller acreages of soybeans, oats, and wheat. Before the war, he'd employed 2 full-time hired men and seasonal workers during planting and harvest. But both his regular employees had been drafted or taken factory jobs in Des Moines, and seasonal labor had become nearly impossible to find with so many young men gone to war. Hoffmann looked at the 8 German prisoners climbing down from the truck with an expression that revealed nothing. His eyes moved across them with the same detached assessment he might give to livestock being delivered for auction. When he spoke, his voice carried the flattened vowels of rural Iowa, words shaped by generations of farm life that valued economy over elaboration. "You boys know anything about farming?" The silence that followed made clear the answer was no. Hoffmann's mouth tightened into something that wasn't quite a smile. "Well, you're gonna learn. Follow me." Werner had believed his captivity would be a temporary interruption, a pause in his real life until the war ended and normal existence could resume. He thought of the Hoffmann farm as just another prison, slightly larger and less formal than Camp Clarinda, but fundamentally the same. A place to wait. A place to endure until the wheels of history turned enough to release him. He did not realize, could not have realized, that he had just met the man who would redefine what freedom meant to him. That over the next 16 months, the definition of home would blur and shift until the very concept of returning to Germany would feel less like liberation and more like abandonment. That he would come to understand family as something created by shared work and mutual trust rather than by blood or nationality. Klaus Werner stood at the edge of that Iowa cornfield on his first morning of farm labor, a German prisoner surrounded by American landscape, and believed he knew exactly who he was and where he belonged. He was wrong about both. The work began before dawn on that first day. Hoffmann woke the prisoners with a knock on the barn door where they'd been told to bed down in the loft. The straw was dry and surprisingly warm, better than some of the billets Werner had known during his military service. But the hour was brutal. 4:30 in the morning with the stars still sharp in the black sky and frost crunching under their boots as they stumbled down to the farmyard. Hoffmann handed each man a tin cup of coffee so hot it burned Werner's fingers through the metal. The coffee was real, not the ersatz chicory mixture that had become standard in Germany. This small luxury, casually dispensed in a frozen farmyard before dawn, spoke volumes about the two nations' relative circumstances. "Cows first," Hoffmann said, and led them into the dairy barn where 48 Holstein cattle waited to be milked. The animals shifted and lowed in the pre-dawn darkness, their breath steaming in the cold air. Hoffmann demonstrated the milking process with a few economical movements, his gnarled hands moving with the unconscious precision of someone who performed this task 10,000 times. 2 buckets per cow. Don't rush them and they won't kick you. Probably. Werner had never touched a cow before. The animal's warmth, the smell of hay and manure, the rhythmic hiss of milk hitting the bucket, it all felt completely alien. His first attempts were clumsy and unproductive. The cow he'd been assigned shifted irritably and very nearly did kick him. But Hoffmann appeared at his shoulder, not impatient exactly, but matter-of-fact in the way of men accustomed to teaching necessary skills. Steady pressure. Pull and squeeze, don't yank. She can tell when you're nervous. It took Werner 3 times as long as it should have, but eventually he filled his 2 buckets. By the time the milking was complete and the cans had been loaded onto Hoffmann's truck for delivery to the collection point, the sun was breaking over the eastern horizon. Werner's hands ached from the unfamiliar motion. His back hurt from the bent position. His nostrils were filled with smells he'd never encountered. And they hadn't even begun the actual day's work yet. What followed was a 16-hour baptism into agricultural labor. Preparing fields for planting meant walking behind Hoffmann's tractor, a aging John Deere that coughed black smoke and rattled alarmingly but never stopped working. Werner and the other prisoners loaded bags of seed corn, cleared rocks from newly turned soil, repaired fence lines, hauled feed, cleaned equipment, and performed 100 other tasks that Hoffmann demonstrated once and then expected them to replicate with minimal supervision. The American corporal who was supposed to be guarding them spent most of the day leaning against the barn, smoking cigarettes and clearly bored by the entire proceeding. After the first few hours, he didn't even keep his rifle with him, leaving it propped against a fence post while he wandered off to help Hoffmann with some task that required an extra set of hands. The message was clear: where exactly did they think they were going to escape to? The question was valid. Werner looked across the landscape during a brief water break and saw nothing but farmland stretching to every horizon. The nearest town was 7 miles away. They had no civilian clothes, no money, no knowledge of the language beyond basic words, and no plausible story for why 8 German men in prisoner uniforms were wandering across Iowa. Escape wasn't prevented by walls and guards. It was prevented by simple geography and circumstance. Lunch appeared at noon, brought out to the field by Hoffmann's wife, Emma. She was a sturdy woman in her late 50s with iron-gray hair pinned back from a face that had been pretty before decades of farm life weathered it into something harder and more lasting. She set down a basket containing sandwiches made with thick slices of fresh bread, real meat, cheese, and even sliced tomatoes from the previous year's canning. There was a gallon jug of cold milk and a tin of cookies. Emma watched them eat with an expression Werner couldn't quite read. Not hostility, but not warmth either. Careful neutrality. Her youngest son, she had explained in halting German earlier that morning, was serving with the army somewhere in Italy. Her older son had been killed in North Africa in 1943. The presence of German prisoners on her farm was complicated by these facts in ways that showed in the tightness around her eyes. "You eat," she said finally. "Work can't be done on empty stomachs." The food was extraordinary by Werner's standards. Not because it was fancy or elaborate, but because it was real and plentiful. There was as much as he wanted. Nobody counted portions or worried about supplies. The casual abundance of an Iowa farm in wartime exceeded anything available in Germany before the war had even started. Each sandwich, each glass of milk, each simple cookie represented a message about the relative circumstances of the two nations that propaganda could not erase or explain away. The days settled into pattern. Wake before dawn, milk the cows, work the fields, break for meals that never seemed inadequate, work until darkness made continuing impossible, evening chores, then collapse into exhausted sleep in the barn loft. Werner's body, conditioned by military training but unused to sustained agricultural labor, protested violently for the first week. Every muscle ached. His hands developed blisters that broke and reformed into calluses. His face and neck burned from exposure to sun that reflected off still frozen ground with unexpected intensity. But something unexpected was happening beneath the physical exhaustion. The work had rhythm and meaning that military service had lacked. Each task completed had visible results. Fields that had been rough and chaotic became ordered and prepared for planting. Equipment that had been broken was repaired and functional. Fences that had sagged were restored to straight alignment. At the end of each day, Werner could look back and see what he had accomplished with his hands. Hoffmann was not a talkative man. He gave instructions in economical phrases, demonstrated when words proved insufficient, and corrected mistakes without anger or contempt. He expected competence and gave respect in proportion to the effort shown. When Werner learned to milk the cows without spooking them, Hoffmann acknowledged this with a brief nod. When Werner figured out how to harness the draft horses correctly, Hoffmann handed him the reins and let him drive the team without supervision. This was profoundly different from military hierarchy where respect flowed from rank and authority was maintained through distance. On the Hoffmann farm, the social order was built on demonstrated skill and mutual dependence. The work required everyone's contribution. A prisoner who learned fast and worked hard was simply a valuable farmhand, regardless of what uniform he'd worn 6 months earlier. The transformation was subtle at first, almost imperceptible. Werner stopped thinking of farm tasks as punishment labor and began taking pride in doing them well. He paid attention when Hoffmann explained the logic behind crop rotation or the mechanics of tractor maintenance. He learned to read the weather by watching the sky, to judge soil readiness by its smell and texture, to understand the complex choreography of farm operations that made a 300-acre operation function. In May, when planting began in earnest, Werner worked 18-hour days alongside Hoffmann and the other prisoners. The tractor ran from dawn until well after dark, pulling the planter across fields in precise rows while men walked behind, ensuring the equipment functioned correctly. The work was exhausting but also urgent in a way that felt meaningful. The window for optimal planting was brief. Miss it, and the entire year's crop would suffer. Emma began bringing more elaborate meals to the field as the planting rush intensified. Proper hot dinners with meat, potatoes, and vegetables. Fresh bread still warm from the oven. Once, on a particularly brutal day when they'd worked through both lunch and dinner to finish a field before forecast rain arrived, she appeared with a pot of stew and a basket of rolls. The prisoners and Hoffmann ate together, sitting on the ground at the edge of the field while darkness gathered and the first drops of rain began to fall. "Got it done," Hoffmann said, more to himself than to anyone else. Then he looked at Werner and the others. "Good work." The words were simple, but they carried weight that Werner felt in his chest. Not because he craved approval from his captor, but because he had genuinely worked hard and the achievement was real. They had planted 90 acres in 2 days. The crop would grow or fail based on factors beyond anyone's control, but they had done their part correctly and completely. Something shifted in that moment. Some internal barrier that had kept Werner emotionally distant from the work, from the place, from the people. He was still a prisoner. The war was still being fought. But sitting in that Iowa field with rain beginning to fall and exhaustion settling into his bones, he felt something he hadn't experienced since his capture. He felt useful. He felt part of something larger than himself that was built rather than destroyed, that created rather than consumed. The summer months transformed the landscape from brown to green with a speed that astonished Werner. The corn grew from ankle-high seedlings to shoulder-height plants in what seemed like weeks. The oats turned golden. The soybeans filled in their rows until the fields became solid masses of vegetation. Each morning brought visible change, proof that the work they'd done was producing results exactly as intended. Hoffmann's farm existed in a delicate balance that became clear to Werner as he learned its rhythms. Every decision affected something else. Plant too early and late frost could kill the crop. Plant too late and the shortened growing season would reduce yields. Apply too much fertilizer and you'd pollute the creek that ran through the South 40. Apply too little and the crop would be thin and unproductive. Rotate crops properly and the soil stayed healthy. Plant the same thing year after year and you'd mine the nutrients until nothing would grow. This web of consequences and interdependencies created a kind of knowledge that was entirely different from what Werner had learned as a machinist's son or as a Luftwaffe pilot. It was practical wisdom accumulated over generations and passed down through demonstration and correction. Hoffmann had learned it from his father, who had learned it from his father, who had learned it from his father who had homesteaded this land in the 1870s after immigrating from Germany. This fact, when Emma mentioned it casually one evening, landed on Werner with unexpected force. Hoffmann's grandfather had been German. Had probably spoken the same language Werner did. Had left the same country Werner still thought of as home. And had come to Iowa to build something permanent out of empty prairie. Werner found himself looking at Hoffmann with new questions that he didn't quite know how to articulate. What had that journey been like? What had the grandfather left behind? Had he ever regretted the choice? Did Hoffmann know any German words beyond the few he used to give instructions? The answers came gradually, revealed in fragments during evening conversations on the porch after the day's work was complete. Hoffmann's German had been forgotten by his generation. His father had spoken it but refused to teach his children during the First World War when being German in America had become suddenly complicated. But the family still attended the German Lutheran church in town, though services had long since switched to English. They still made certain traditional foods during holidays. They still remembered, in that attenuated way that immigrant families remember, where they had come from. In July, Hoffmann's daughter arrived from Des Moines with her 2 children. Sarah was 31, a widow whose husband had been killed at Pearl Harbor in 1941. She worked in a defense plant making shell casings, and her children stayed with her parents during the week, returning home only on weekends. The little girl was 7, the boy was 5, and both of them were utterly fascinated by the German prisoners working their grandfather's farm. Werner encountered them one morning while carrying buckets of feed to the chicken coop. They were standing by the fence, watching him with the unguarded curiosity of children who hadn't yet learned to see enemies instead of interesting strangers. "Are you really from Germany?" the girl asked in English. Werner's English was limited but improving from months of exposure. "Ja. Yes. I am from Germany. Did you fly airplanes and shoot people?" The directness of the question was jarring. How did you explain to a 7-year-old that yes, you had attempted to kill people very much like her father? That you had been part of a machinery of destruction that had contributed, however indirectly, to her becoming fatherless? "I was soldier," Werner said carefully. "War is finished for me now. Sarah appeared then, moving quickly to gather her children with a mother's protective instinct. But before she could hurry them away, the little girl said something that stopped everyone. "Grandpa says you're a good worker." It was a child's observation, innocent of the complex moral calculations that informed adult judgments. But it contained an implicit argument about what mattered in the present moment versus what had mattered in the past. Werner was a good worker. This was observable fact. What he had been before, what uniform he'd worn, what nation he'd fought for, all of that was important, but it was also separate from the reality of what he was doing now. Sarah looked at Werner for a long moment. Something passed across her face that was neither forgiveness nor condemnation, but rather a kind of weary acknowledgement that life continued despite tragedy and that farm work needed doing regardless of who did it. "Come on, kids. Let's let Mr. Werner get back to his work." But the interaction had opened something. Over the following weeks, the children appeared frequently, drawn by that magnetic curiosity that sees opportunity for interesting conversation in every adult. Werner found himself explaining, in his broken English supplemented with gestures, basic facts about Germany, about farming, about the differences between draft horses and tractors, about why chickens were simultaneously fascinating and annoying creatures. The children's acceptance was simpler than their mothers' or grandparents', unburdened by adult understanding of moral complexity. But it created a kind of bridge that hadn't existed before. Sarah stopped avoiding the prisoners. She began bringing lemonade to the field on hot afternoons. She started conversations about weather and crops with the same matter-of-fact practicality her father employed. In August, when the corn reached its full height and the tassels began releasing pollen that turned the air golden in evening light, Hoffmann asked Werner a question that would prove far more significant than either of them realized at the time. "You thinking about what comes after?" Werner didn't understand at first. "After what?" "After the war," Hoffmann clarified. "You got plans?" The question was impossible to answer honestly because Werner hadn't allowed himself to think that far ahead. Return to Germany seemed like the obvious path, the expected trajectory. But return to what? Hamburg had been bombed into near total destruction. His parents were dead, killed in the firestorm raids of 1943. His brother had been killed on the Eastern Front. His fiancée had written him one letter after his capture, then nothing. The Germany he'd left in 1943 was gone, and whatever would exist after the war's end was unknowable. "I don't know," Werner said finally. "I think maybe there is nothing to return to." Hoffmann nodded slowly, chewing on a piece of hay he'd pulled from his pocket. "War's a bastard that way. Breaks things you can't see until after." They stood in silence for a while, watching the sun sink toward the western horizon. Somewhere far away, the war was still being fought. Young men were still dying in actions whose outcomes would determine the political future of continents. But here in this Iowa cornfield, the immediate concerns were simpler. Would the weather hold? Was the soil moisture adequate? Would the harvest be good? "You're a decent worker," Hoffmann said eventually. "Learn fast. Don't complain. That counts for something." Werner didn't fully understand the implication of this observation until months later. But the seed had been planted. The suggestion that his value as a person extended beyond his nationality or his military service. That what he could do with his hands and his mind might matter more than the circumstances of his birth. The harvest came in September and October, a frenzy of activity that made planting look leisurely by comparison. The corn picker, a mechanical marvel that Hoffmann treated with the reverent care usually reserved for religious artifacts, ran from dawn until well after dark. The sound of its engine became the soundtrack of those weeks, punctuated by the rattle of corn being gathered and the metallic clang of wagons being hooked and unhooked for transport. Werner learned to operate the picker, then the elevator that loaded corn into the crib, then the truck that hauled loads to the grain elevator in town. Each skill represented trust that Hoffmann extended without ceremony or announcement. The equipment was expensive and temperamental. Mistakes could be costly. But Hoffmann watched Werner work for a few hours, saw that he understood the machinery and respected it, and simply handed over responsibility. By October, when the last of the corn was finally in and the fields lay stripped and brown under autumn skies, Werner had become something he hadn't anticipated. He had become a farmer. Not in the sense of owning land or having generational knowledge, but in the sense of possessing skills and understanding that made him valuable in this agricultural world. He could milk cows, operate machinery, judge soil conditions, repair equipment, plan work sequences, anticipate problems. The transformation had been so gradual that he hadn't noticed it happening. But sitting at the Hoffmann's kitchen table one evening in November, the prisoners had been invited inside for dinner as temperatures dropped below freezing. Werner realized that when he thought about his future, the images that came to mind were no longer of Hamburg or Germany or returning to machinist work. They were of fields being planted, of equipment being maintained, of seasons turning in their eternal agricultural cycle. This realization was deeply unsettling. It felt like betrayal. His duty as a German soldier was to remain loyal to his homeland, to resist cultural assimilation, to maintain his identity separate from his captors. But that identity had been built on foundations that no longer existed. The Luftwaffe was destroyed. The Reich was collapsing. Hamburg was rubble. His family was gone. What exactly was he remaining loyal to? The answer came on a Sunday afternoon in December when Corporal Henderson, who had been their nominal guard for 8 months, arrived at the farm with orders transferring the prisoners back to Camp Clarinda. The war in Europe was clearly entering its final phase. Plans were being made for large-scale repatriation. The agricultural labor program would be winding down as regular workers returned from military service and defense jobs. Werner and the 7 other prisoners loaded onto the truck that would take them back to the camp. Hoffmann and Emma stood in the farmyard, watching them leave. The old man's face showed nothing, but he raised one hand in a brief farewell gesture. Emma held a handkerchief to her face. Sarah and the children were there too. The little girl, now 8 years old, waved enthusiastically. "Bye, Mr. Werner. Come back and visit." Children can say things that adults cannot. Can express sentiments that would be inappropriate or impossible coming from grown mouths. That a German prisoner might visit an Iowa farm after the war ended was a fantasy, obviously. But it was also a kind of acknowledgement that relationships had formed which transcended the formal categories of captor and prisoner, enemy and ally. As the truck pulled away and the Hoffmann farm receded into the distance, Werner felt something unexpected. Not relief at leaving hard agricultural labor behind, but loss. A sense that he was leaving something valuable that he might not find again. Camp Clarinda felt different when Werner returned. The routines were the same: roll call, meals, work details, recreation periods, but Werner's relationship to them had changed. The months on the Hoffmann farm had given him an alternative reference point, a comparison that made the camp's organized emptiness feel artificial and purposeless. The other prisoners sensed this in him. Men who had spent the entire war in various POW camps, who had never worked outside the wire, who had maintained their identity through rigid adherence to military discipline and German cultural practices, looked at Werner with something between suspicion and curiosity. He had been contaminated by too much contact with Americans. He had lost the proper hostile distance between prisoner and captor. But Werner wasn't the only one. Other men had worked farms, factories, lumber camps. They returned with similar experiences of Americans who had treated them with practical fairness, who had shared meals and conversations, who had behaved nothing like the propaganda had described. The camp divided informally between those who clung to pre-war certainties and those who had begun to question what exactly they would be returning to when repatriation occurred. The news from Germany made those questions increasingly urgent. The Battle of the Bulge came and went. The Soviets advanced from the east while Americans and British pushed from the west. Cities that had survived earlier bombing were systematically destroyed. Civilian casualties mounted into the millions. The reports were fragmentary and probably censored, but the overall trajectory was unmistakable. Germany was being demolished. In February 1945, Werner received his first letter from Germany in 8 months. It came from a distant cousin in Bavaria who had somehow tracked him down through Red Cross channels. The letter's contents were devastating. What remained of Hamburg was occupied by British forces. The cousin had tried to find Werner's family address but discovered only rubble where the apartment building had stood. Nobody in the neighborhood knew what had happened to the residents. They had either been killed in the firestorm raids or had fled to the countryside. The letter continued with equally grim news about other family members, about conditions in Germany, about the chaos of the war's final phase. But it was the final paragraph that Werner read and reread until he could recite it from memory. "I do not know if there will be anything left to return to when the war finally ends. They tell us we are fighting for Germany, but there is no Germany anymore, only ruins and death. If you are safe where you are, Klaus, perhaps you should consider staying safe. There is nothing here but ghosts. Werner sat in the barracks with the letter in his hands and felt something fundamental shift inside him. The life he had lived before his capture was simply gone. Not paused, not waiting for him to return, but erased. The Hamburg of his childhood existed only in memory. The people he had loved were dead or scattered. The country he had fought for was being partitioned between powers who would reshape it according to their own interests. What exactly was he returning to? The question gnawed at him through the spring as rumors of Germany's collapse became confirmed reports of Germany's surrender. May 8, 1945. Victory in Europe. The war that had consumed 6 years and killed millions was finally over. In Camp Clarinda, the German prisoners received the news with complex emotions that ranged from relief to despair. The war's end meant eventual repatriation, but it also meant confronting the full reality of defeat and destruction. American guards celebrated with restrained professionalism. Some were drunk by evening. Others were simply relieved that they wouldn't be reassigned to the Pacific Theater, which was still actively fighting. The camp commander made a brief announcement acknowledging the war's end and assuring prisoners that Geneva Convention protocols would continue to be observed during the repatriation process. But repatriation proved more complicated than anyone anticipated. Germany was occupied, divided, and in various states of administrative chaos. The logistics of returning hundreds of thousands of prisoners required coordination between multiple governments and organizations. Food shortages in Europe made the prospect of adding repatriated prisoners to the population deeply problematic. American officials began suggesting that many prisoners might need to remain in the United States for an extended period until conditions in Germany stabilized. For Werner, this unexpected delay became an opportunity. In June, the agricultural labor program resumed for prisoners who volunteered to participate. The logic was pragmatic: American farms still needed workers, prisoners still needed purposeful occupation, and the Geneva Convention allowed for voluntary labor. Werner signed up immediately. The paperwork asked which farm he wanted to be assigned to. Werner wrote Hoffmann Farm in the space provided and submitted the form with no certainty it would be honored. But 2 weeks later, Corporal Henderson appeared at his barracks with orders assigning him back to the Hoffmann place. Not as part of a group this time, but as a single prisoner detail. The truck ride out to the farm felt like a homecoming. Werner recognized landmarks: the creek that ran through the South 40, the windbreak of cottonwoods on the western boundary, the red barn that needed painting. When the truck pulled into the farmyard and Werner saw Hoffmann standing by the equipment shed, the old man's face broke into something that might have been a smile if you looked quickly. "Figured you'd come back," Hoffmann said. "Got work if you want it." The summer of 1945 was different from the previous year. Werner worked alone rather than as part of a prisoner group. He stayed in a small bedroom in the farmhouse rather than in the barn loft. He ate meals with the family, sitting at the same table as Hoffmann and Emma and Sarah and the children when they visited. The formal boundaries between prisoner and captor had become blurred to near invisibility. The work was the same: endless agricultural labor from dawn until dark, the rhythm of planting and tending and harvesting. But Werner's relationship to it had changed. He was no longer simply working time until he could return to his real life. This was becoming his real life. These fields, this family, this landscape that bore no resemblance to Germany but had become more familiar to him than his memories of Hamburg. In August, Japan surrendered. The war, truly and completely, was over. America exploded with celebrations. In Iowa, farmers allowed themselves cautious optimism that their sons and brothers would finally come home. For German prisoners, the surrender meant that repatriation planning would accelerate. The question was no longer whether they would return to Germany, but when. Werner began receiving official notices. His name appeared on provisional repatriation lists. Expected departure dates were announced, then postponed, then revised. The administrative machinery of demobilization ground slowly through its procedures. Meanwhile, he continued working the Hoffmann farm, harvesting corn, preparing fields for winter, repairing equipment. One evening in October, Hoffmann asked Werner to walk with him to check fences on the north boundary. It was the kind of task that didn't require two people, which meant Hoffmann wanted to talk about something that needed privacy. They walked in silence for a while, boots scuffing through fallen leaves, while evening light turned the landscape golden. "Emma and I've been talking," Hoffmann said finally. "About what happens after." Werner waited, uncertain where this was leading. "You're on those repatriation lists. They'll be sending you back soon." Yes. Maybe December. Maybe January. You want to go back? The question was direct in Hoffmann's characteristically blunt style. Werner had been avoiding thinking about it clearly, but the old man's question demanded an honest answer. I don't know what I am going back to, Werner said. My home is destroyed. My family is dead. Germany is. He struggled for words. Germany is not the country I left. Hoffmann nodded slowly. War does that. Changes everything so you don't recognize it anymore. They reached the fence line and began walking along it, checking for breaks and damage. The work gave their hands something to do while their minds worked through more difficult territory. There's something you should know, Hoffmann said. Emma's cousin, he's a lawyer in Des Moines. We talked to him about the situation. About what options might exist for prisoners who don't want to go back. Werner stopped walking. This was unexpected territory, dangerous in its implications. The law's complicated, Hoffmann continued. But there are provisions. Displaced person status. Agricultural worker visas. It's not simple, but it's possible. For someone who's proven themselves. Someone who's got sponsorship. The old man looked at Werner directly. I'm saying we could help you stay. If that's what you wanted. There's work here. The farm's bigger than I can manage by myself anymore, especially now that I'm getting old. Could use someone who knows what they're doing. Someone who isn't afraid of real labor. Werner felt something break open inside his chest. What Hoffmann was offering was more than just continued employment. It was permission to choose a different future than the one history had assigned him. It was an invitation to become something other than a defeated German prisoner waiting to return to ruins. I would be staying in America, Werner said slowly, testing the words. Living here. Working this farm. That's about the size of it. What about the war? What I was? People would know I was German. People already know, Hoffmann said dryly. You got that accent that isn't going anywhere. But here's the thing about farming communities, they care more about what you can do than where you came from. My grandfather was German. Half the farmers in this county got German names. You do good work, treat people fair, pay your debts, you become part of the community. That's how it works. Werner looked out across the fields that he had planted and tended and harvested. He thought about the chickens he fed every morning, the cows he milked, the equipment he maintained. He thought about Sarah's children who called him Mr. Werner and asked him questions about Germany with innocent curiosity. He thought about Emma who had gradually stopped treating him with careful distance and had begun to simply treat him as another person at her table. And he thought about his cousin's letter, about Hamburg being nothing but rubble, about returning to a Germany that existed only in his memory and his guilt. I would need to think about this, Werner said finally. Course you would, Hoffmann replied. It's a big decision. But I needed you to know it's possible. That there's an option here if you want it. They finished checking the fence in silence and walked back to the farmhouse as darkness settled over Iowa. The decision Werner faced was impossible to make through pure logic. It required him to choose between loyalty to an abstract concept of home and the reality of where he felt most himself. Between obligation to a past that no longer existed and opportunity for a future that hadn't been part of any plan. That night, Werner lay awake in his small bedroom, listening to the house settle and creak around him. He could hear Emma and Hoffmann talking quietly in their room down the hall. Could smell the lingering scent of dinner, pot roast and potatoes and fresh bread. Could feel the exhaustion in his muscles from a day of good hard work that had visible results. He tried to imagine returning to Germany. Traveling back across the Atlantic, processing through whatever administrative nightmare awaited defeated prisoners, arriving in Hamburg or what remained of it, trying to find surviving relatives, trying to find work in a bombed-out economy, trying to rebuild a life among people who would see him as a failure for having been captured, for having survived when so many didn't. Then he tried to imagine staying in Iowa. Working the Hoffmann farm through seasons that would slowly become familiar. Learning more English, improving his skills, becoming a permanent fixture in this agricultural landscape. Eventually, perhaps, owning his own land. Building something that lasted. Creating a future out of nothing but willingness to work and faith that effort mattered. The second vision was clearer and more detailed than the first. Which told him everything he needed to know. In November 1945, Klaus Werner submitted formal documentation requesting displaced person status and agricultural worker immigration consideration. The paperwork required affidavits from American citizens attesting to his character and employability. Hoffmann provided one. Emma provided another. To Werner's surprise, Sarah also provided one, writing that she had observed him for over a year and found him to be trustworthy, hardworking, and good with her children. The process was neither quick nor certain. Immigration authorities were suspicious of German prisoners seeking to remain in America. Questions arose about Werner's military service, his political affiliations, his motivations. Multiple interviews were conducted. Background checks were performed. The whole machinery of bureaucratic suspicion ground slowly through its protocols. But Hoffmann had understated his cousin's capabilities. The lawyer in Des Moines was well connected and familiar with the labyrinth of immigration law. He knew which officials needed which assurances, which documents needed which phrasing, which arguments would carry weight and which would trigger rejection. The case was prepared with the thoroughness of a military campaign. In March 1946, Werner received official notification that his application for displaced person status had been approved, contingent on continued agricultural employment. He would be released from prisoner status and granted residency as a sponsored agricultural worker. If he maintained employment and stayed out of legal trouble for 5 years, he could apply for permanent residency and eventually citizenship. The day Werner signed the final papers, he ceased to be a prisoner of war. The transformation was purely administrative. One set of documents was replaced by another set of documents, but the psychological shift was profound. For the first time since his capture nearly 3 years earlier, his future was not determined by military defeat and enforced repatriation. It was determined by his own choices and efforts. Other prisoners learned of Werner's decision. Some were horrified. To stay in America after Germany's defeat was betrayal of the worst sort. He was abandoning his homeland, his heritage, his duty. He was choosing comfort over honor, personal benefit over national loyalty. They shunned him with the righteous anger of men who still believed in ideologies that the war had demolished. But others understood. They too had worked American farms and factories. They too had experienced practical fairness from people they'd been taught to hate. They too had received letters from Germany describing conditions that made return seem like volunteering for continued suffering. Some of them began asking Werner questions about the process, about what was required, about whether they might be able to follow the same path. Werner returned to the Hoffmann farm on April 1, 1946, exactly 2 years after his first morning of agricultural labor there. But he returned as an employee rather than a prisoner, as an immigrant rather than a defeated enemy. The distinction mattered. It changed the terms of his presence from temporary to potentially permanent, from coerced to chosen. Hoffmann marked the occasion in his characteristic way, by immediately putting Werner to work on spring planting. "Welcome back," the old man said. "Now grab those seed bags. We're burning daylight." The first year after his release from prisoner status was both easier and harder than Werner expected. The work remained the same, agricultural labor through seasons that had become familiar. But his relationship to everything around him was subtly different. He was no longer protected by the formal boundaries of POW status. He was simply a German immigrant trying to make a life in rural Iowa in the immediate aftermath of the war his country had lost. The community's reaction was complex. Some accepted him with the same pragmatic fairness that Hoffmann had demonstrated. He was a skilled worker. The farm produced good yields under his labor. That counted for more than abstract political considerations. But others were less forgiving. Their sons and brothers had died fighting Germans. The discovery that a former Luftwaffe pilot was living openly on the Hoffmann place generated controversy that could not be ignored. Werner encountered this hostility one Saturday afternoon in the town of Clarinda. He'd driven in with Hoffmann to pick up equipment parts and found himself face to face with a man in his 50s wearing an American Legion cap. The man had clearly been drinking, and his expression turned ugly when he heard Werner's accent. "You're that German bastard from Hoffmann's place. The one who's staying." Werner tried to move past him, but the man stepped into his path. A small crowd had begun to form, drawn by the confrontation the way people always are by potential violence. "My boy died on Omaha Beach. You know what that means. He died fighting your kind. And now you're here, living free, working a farm while my boy rots in France." The accusation was factually accurate and emotionally devastating. Werner had no defense that would satisfy this father's rage. He had been part of the war machine that killed American boys. That he had also been part of the same machine that killed German boys, that he had lost his own family to Allied bombing, that individual soldiers were victims of forces larger than any personal choice, none of this changed the fundamental truth of the man's grief. "I am sorry for your loss," Werner said carefully. "The war was terrible for everyone. Sorry don't bring him back. And it don't explain why you get to stay here instead of going back where you belong." Hoffmann appeared then, emerging from the hardware store with the parts they'd come to purchase. The old man assessed the situation with one glance and positioned himself beside Werner with the unconscious solidarity of someone defending his own. "Werner belongs exactly where he is," Hoffmann said quietly. "Working my farm. Contributing to this community. He didn't start the war, and he sure as hell didn't ask to be shot down over England. But he's here now, and he's earned his place." "You're defending a Nazi?" The veteran's voice rose with outrage. "I'm defending a good worker who's never given me or anyone else cause for complaint. War's over. Time to figure out how to live with that." The confrontation could have escalated. Other veterans were present, men with similar grievances and similar rage at the injustice of their sacrifices. But Hoffmann's reputation carried weight. He had lost a son at Kasserine Pass. His surviving son was still in Germany as part of the occupation forces. If anyone had earned the right to be angry at Germans, it was Albert Hoffmann. And if he chose to employ Werner, who exactly had the authority to say he was wrong? The crowd dispersed slowly. The veteran spat at Werner's feet and walked away, but the moment of potential violence passed. Werner and Hoffmann loaded their purchases into the truck and drove back to the farm in silence. Neither mentioned the incident again, but it had clarified something important. Werner's presence would always be complicated by history. Acceptance would never be complete or simple. He would always be the German, always be marked by what he had been before. But he would also have allies. People who judged him by his actions rather than his nationality. People who believed that individuals deserved the chance to choose their own futures regardless of what governments had done in their names. Sarah proved to be another unexpected ally. She began bringing her children to the farm more frequently, ostensibly to help her aging parents but also, Werner gradually realized, to normalize his presence. If her children, whose father had died fighting Japan, could interact normally with a former German pilot, it sent a powerful message to the community. Forgiveness was possible. Moving forward was possible. Life could continue despite the war's scars. The children themselves had none of their elders' ambivalence. They had known Werner as Mr. Werner the farmhand for 2 years. That he had once worn a different uniform and fought for a different cause was historical abstraction that interested them less than the practical question of whether he would help them climb trees or explain how the tractor engine worked. "Why did you want to stay here instead of going home?" the girl asked him one afternoon while they were feeding chickens. Werner considered how to answer. How do you explain to a 9-year-old that home is not a fixed location but a feeling of belonging that can be destroyed by bombs and rebuilt by daily work and gradual trust? "Because this feels like home now," he said simply. "Sometimes you find home in places you didn't expect." She accepted this with a child's willingness to embrace straightforward truths. "I'm glad you stayed. Grandpa says you're the best worker he's ever had." Small victories. Small moments of acceptance. Werner learned to be content with incremental progress rather than demanding complete understanding. He learned to live with being perpetually other while also gradually becoming part of the community's fabric. His English improved until his accent softened and his vocabulary expanded beyond agricultural terms. He learned American idioms and jokes. He attended the German Lutheran church in town, where other families with immigrant backgrounds welcomed him cautiously. He joined the volunteer fire department, where practical skills mattered more than political history. He contributed to community fundraisers and helped neighbors with farm work during their emergencies. By 1948, when the initial 5-year requirement for permanent residency was halfway complete, Werner had become a fixture of the landscape rather than a controversial outsider. People still knew he was German, still remembered his POW status, but it had faded from immediate relevance to background knowledge that informed their interactions without dominating them. The Hoffmann farm prospered under Werner's labor and increasing responsibility. Hoffmann, now in his late 60s, began delegating more decision-making authority. Werner planned crop rotations, managed equipment maintenance schedules, handled negotiations with suppliers and buyers. The farm operated more efficiently than it had in years, producing yields that attracted notice from the county agricultural extension agent. In 1949, Hoffmann made Werner a formal offer, partnership in the farm's operation. Not ownership, the land would remain Hoffmann property, but profit-sharing and management authority that recognized Werner's essential contribution. The agreement was formalized through the Des Moines lawyer who had handled Werner's immigration case. It represented both practical business arrangement and symbolic acceptance of Werner as family rather than merely employee. Emma's health began declining that same year. The decades of farm labor had worn her body down in ways that finally demanded acknowledgement. She needed help with household tasks that she had always managed independently. Sarah took leave from her defense plant job, which was winding down as wartime production contracts ended, and moved back to the farm with her children to care for her mother. Werner found himself part of an expanded household that looked nothing like traditional family structure but functioned with the same essential rhythms of mutual support and shared responsibility. He worked the fields with Hoffmann. He helped Sarah with heavy household tasks. He watched Emma slowly decline while trying to maintain the dignified independence that had defined her life. He drove the children to school and helped them with homework in the evenings. If anyone had asked Werner what family meant, he would have struggled to articulate it clearly. But he would have described this: the daily effort of multiple people working toward common goals, the accumulation of small kindnesses and shared challenges, the creation of bonds through time and trust rather than through blood or law. Emma died in November 1950, quietly in her sleep after an evening spent sitting on the porch watching the last light fade from fields she had helped work for 40 years. Her funeral was attended by what seemed like half the county. Werner stood with Hoffmann and Sarah and the children, not as employee or outsider but as family member. Nobody questioned his presence. He had earned his place through years of demonstrating that he belonged there. After Emma's death, the household reconfigured again. Sarah remained on the farm permanently, taking over her mother's role in managing the domestic operations while also helping with field work during busy seasons. The children grew from elementary age toward adolescence, increasingly capable of contributing to farm labor and less in need of constant supervision. Werner applied for citizenship in 1951. The process was simpler than his initial immigration application but still required extensive documentation and demonstration of good moral character. Hoffmann provided reference letters. So did the Lutheran church pastor, the county sheriff, and several neighboring farmers. The hearing was brief and perfunctory. Werner recited the oath of citizenship in English that had become fluent enough that his German accent was more charming quirk than obstacle to understanding. On the day he received his citizenship certificate, Werner sat alone in his room holding the document and trying to process what it meant. He was now American by law as well as by choice. He could vote, own property, travel without restriction. But more importantly, he had completed a journey from enemy prisoner to belonging that had taken 7 years and required letting go of one identity to embrace another. He did not feel guilty about this, though he knew some would argue he should. The Germany he had left no longer existed. The country that now carried that name was divided and occupied, struggling to rebuild from total destruction, haunted by questions about complicity and guilt that would take generations to process. Werner had made peace with his service by accepting that he had been young and mistaken and caught in historical forces beyond individual control. What mattered now was what he chose to do with the life he had been given. And he chose to farm 320 acres of Iowa soil with people who had become his family. He chose to help raise children who would never know war. He chose to contribute to a community that had reluctantly accepted him and gradually embraced him. Hoffmann's health began failing in the mid-1950s. The cumulative effects of decades of hard physical labor could no longer be ignored or worked through. His limp became more pronounced. His stamina decreased. He began having difficulty with tasks that he performed automatically his entire life. Werner took on more of the farm's management, consulting with the old man but making most of the daily operational decisions. In 1957, Hoffmann proposed selling Werner a quarter of the farm's acreage. The legal paperwork could be structured to protect Hoffmann's financial interests while giving Werner ownership stake in land he had worked for 13 years. It would require Werner to take out a mortgage, assume significant debt, and commit to Iowa farming for the indefinite future. It would mark his complete transformation from German prisoner to American landowner. Werner accepted the offer. The closing took place in the Des Moines lawyer's office with Hoffmann and Sarah as witnesses. When Werner signed his name to the deed, he became owner of 80 acres of some of the most productive agricultural land in America. He had literally earned this through the sweat of his labor, one day at a time, one season at a time, one harvest at a time. That evening, Werner walked the boundaries of his land. The sunset turned the sky orange and purple as he moved through fields he had planted and harvested for over a decade. He knew every contour of this soil, every drainage pattern, every trouble spot where equipment got stuck after heavy rain. He knew which acres produced the best yields and which needed more attention. He knew this land more intimately than he had ever known the streets of Hamburg where he'd grown up. He thought about the young Luftwaffe Unteroffizier who had been shot down over England in 1943. That man had believed in nation and duty and sacrifice. He had flown bombers over England with the certainty that his cause was right and his enemies were wrong. He had been proud of his uniform and his service and his place in the grand machinery of war. That man was dead, killed not by flak or enemy fire but by the slow erosion of certainty that came from working alongside people he had been taught to hate. From discovering that the enemy possessed the same basic humanity, the same capacity for fairness, the same desire to build rather than destroy. From learning that belonging could be created through shared labor and mutual respect rather than being determined by birth and blood. Werner had become someone different. Someone who measured success by harvest yields rather than military objectives. Someone who built fences instead of dropping bombs. Someone who created life-sustaining crops instead of participating in death-dealing machinery. The transformation was complete. Hoffmann died in 1962, at 74, after a final year of declining health that he bore with the same stoic pragmatism he had brought to every other challenge. His funeral was as well attended as his wife's had been 12 years earlier. Werner delivered a eulogy in English that had become indistinguishable from any Iowa native speech. Albert Hoffmann taught me what it meant to be a good man, Werner said, standing at the front of the Lutheran church before a congregation that had watched this entire improbable story unfold. Not through speeches or lectures, but through showing me every day what mattered. Hard work. Fair dealing. Judging people by their actions instead of their words. Taking care of land so it can take care of you. Building something that lasts. He paused, looking out at faces he had known for nearly 2 decades. I came to this country as a prisoner, as an enemy, as someone who had fought against everything you believed in. Albert Hoffmann saw past all of that. He gave me a chance when he didn't have to. He treated me fairly when others wouldn't have. He became like a father to me when my own father was gone. The emotion in his voice was genuine. This old farmer who had been suspicious and careful and practical had given Werner something more valuable than land or employment. He had given him the possibility of redemption through work, the chance to prove that identity could be chosen rather than inherited, the understanding that family could be built through shared effort rather than being limited to blood relation. After Hoffmann's death, Werner and Sarah continued working the farm together. Their relationship had evolved over the years from landlord's daughter and prisoner to something that defied easy categorization. They were business partners, certainly. They were friends, definitely. But gradually, carefully, with the slow caution of 2 people who had both been badly hurt by war, they became something more. They married in 1964, a quiet ceremony at the Lutheran church with just close friends and Sarah's children in attendance. Werner was 44, Sarah was 50. Neither was under any illusions about romantic passion or fairy tale endings. But they had built something real through years of shared labor and mutual respect. They understood each other's scars and capabilities. They made a good team, which in agricultural life was sometimes more important than being in love. The children, now teenagers, accepted Werner as a stepfather with the same practical pragmatism that characterized everything about farm life. He had been present in their lives for 18 years. He had helped raise them, taught them skills, been there through their childhood dramas and triumphs. The formal ceremony of marriage changed their legal relationship but not the essential reality of their bonds. Werner became owner of the entire farm when Hoffmann's will was probated. The old man had structured his estate to provide for Sarah while ensuring the farm could continue operating as a single unit. Werner assumed full ownership with the understanding that he would care for the land the way Hoffmann had cared for it, as a trust passed down through generations, not as a commodity to be exploited for maximum profit. He kept this promise. The farm prospered through the 1960s and 1970s as agricultural technology advanced and techniques improved. But Werner maintained traditional crop rotation practices that Hoffmann had taught him. He resisted pressure to abandon small-scale diversified farming in favor of industrial monoculture. He treated the soil as something alive that needed care rather than as mere substrate for chemical inputs. Klaus Werner lived the rest of his life as an Iowa farmer, respected in his community, successful in his business, content in his choices. He raised Sarah's children and eventually helped raise her grandchildren. He became a fixture at the Lutheran Church and the Volunteer Fire Department and the County Farm Bureau. He voted in American elections and paid American taxes and complained about American politics with the same enthusiasm as everyone else. The transformation was so complete that younger people who knew him simply as Werner the farmer would have been shocked to learn he'd been a German Luftwaffe pilot and a prisoner of war. That history existed only in old records and fading memories of people who had known him when he first arrived. For most practical purposes, Klaus Werner had become simply another American farmer with a faint accent that added character to his speech. He died in 1994, at 74, the same age as Hoffmann had reached. Sarah found him in the barn one morning, collapsed near the tractor he'd been maintaining. The doctor said it was a massive heart attack, quick and probably painless. A mercy, given the alternatives available to men in their 70s. His funeral filled the Lutheran Church beyond capacity. The congregation represented 3 generations of people who had known him at different stages of his American life. Neighboring farmers whose land adjoined his. Business associates from the co-op and the grain elevator. Church members who had served alongside him on various committees. Veterans from the Volunteer Fire Department where he'd contributed for decades. Sarah's children spoke about the man who had been their stepfather. They talked about his patience in teaching them to drive tractors, his insistence on doing work correctly rather than quickly, his quiet satisfaction in a day's labor well completed. They talked about someone who had been present in their lives, reliable and steady, someone who had demonstrated through daily example what it meant to take responsibility seriously. What they did not spend much time discussing was his German identity or his prisoner of war status. Not because it was shameful or hidden, but because it had become simply one biographical detail among many. Like the fact that he had learned to milk cows or that he preferred coffee black or that he drove a Ford pickup truck. It was part of his story but not the defining characteristic of his identity. The Lutheran pastor, a young man who had only known Werner in his final decade, tried to capture something essential in his eulogy. Klaus Werner's life was a testament to the possibility of transformation. He came to this country as an enemy and became one of us. Not because he pretended to be something he wasn't, but because he genuinely became part of this community through years of shared work and mutual commitment. The gravestone Sarah chose was simple. Klaus Werner. 1920 to 1994, beloved husband and father. Farmer. The last word said everything that needed to be said. He had found his identity not in the nation of his birth or the uniform he had once worn, but in the work he had chosen to do and the land he had chosen to care for. Years after his death, researchers interested in the POW experience in Iowa would sometimes contact Sarah, seeking information about Werner's time as a prisoner and his decision to stay. She would share what she knew, though much of the internal emotional journey was something Werner had never fully articulated even to her. He had been a private man, more comfortable with action than explanation, more inclined to demonstrate values through behavior than to discuss them directly. But one story she told repeatedly captured something essential about who he had been and why he had chosen to stay. It came from a conversation they'd had in the 1980s, after enough time had passed that both of them felt comfortable examining difficult truths. "Do you ever regret not going back to Germany?" Sarah had asked. Werner had thought about it for a long time before answering. "Sometimes I wonder what my life would have been like if I had returned. But I don't regret my choice. Germany after the war was not the Germany I left. The Hamburg I knew was gone. The people I loved were dead. What would I have returned to?" "You might have rebuilt," Sarah suggested. "Like other Germans did." "Maybe. But I found something here that I didn't expect. Not just work or safety or prosperity, though those mattered. I found a place where I could be useful. Where what I could do mattered more than what I had been. That's worth more than you might think." He had paused, looking out across fields that had become as familiar to him as his own hands. "Your father gave me a chance when he didn't have to. He treated me fairly when others wouldn't have. He taught me that identity is something you build through daily choices, not something you're born with. That's a powerful gift." This was Werner's legacy, the understanding that belonging is created through shared labor and earned trust, that identity can be chosen and built rather than inherited, that the possibility of redemption exists for those willing to do the hard work of transformation. Not through grand gestures or dramatic conversions, but through the accumulation of thousands of small choices to show up, work hard, treat people fairly, and contribute to something larger than yourself. The farm itself continues operating today, passed down through Sarah's children and now their children. They still plant the same fields Werner worked for over 50 years. They still use some of the equipment he maintained. They still follow crop rotation practices that he refined through decades of observation and adjustment. The barn where he first slept as a prisoner still stands, though it's been renovated and repurposed several times. New owners, new generations, new technologies. But the essential work remains the same: planting and tending and harvesting, maintaining the cycle of agricultural production that feeds nations and requires the kind of long-term commitment that Klaus Werner embodied. The land remembers the people who cared for it, though it expresses this memory not in monuments or plaques but in continued fertility and productivity. In the small cemetery beside the Lutheran church, Werner's grave sits in the section reserved for church members who contributed to the community. His stone bears no special markings indicating his unique history. He rests among the farmers and shopkeepers and teachers who made up the fabric of rural Iowa life. To visit his grave knowing nothing of his story, you would see only another local farmer who had lived a long life and died at a respectable age. But knowing his story, that simple gravestone becomes something more profound. It marks the resting place of a man who crossed oceans and survived wars and transformed himself from enemy to neighbor. Who found family among people he'd been taught to hate. Who chose belonging over bitterness, building over returning, future over past. Who demonstrated through 50 years of daily labor that redemption is possible for those willing to work for it. The prisoner who refused freedom to stay with his new family became, in the end, a man who belonged exactly where he was. Not because circumstances had trapped him there, but because he had chosen it, had built it, had earned it through decades of showing up and doing the work and being part of something larger than his individual identity. In that choice, Klaus Werner became more than just one man's story. He became evidence that even in the aftermath of total war, after the worst kinds of destruction and dehumanization, human beings retain the capacity to build connections across enemy lines. To see past propaganda and hatred toward the fundamental truth that most people, regardless of nationality, want similar things: meaningful work, family, belonging, the chance to contribute to something that outlasts them. The prisoner who stayed was not running away from his German identity. He was running toward something he had discovered in Iowa fields: the understanding that identity could be built through choices rather than inherited through birth, that family could be created through trust rather than limited to blood, and that home was not a fixed location but a feeling of belonging that could be found in unexpected places through years of patient effort and earned acceptance. Werner's story suggests that one of the costs of war is the way it forces artificial categories onto human relationships, turning neighbors into enemies and allies into abstractions. But it also suggests that those categories can be transcended by individuals willing to risk vulnerability, to trust in the possibility of transformation, and to judge people by their actions rather than their inherited identities. The German prisoner became the Iowa farmer, became the American citizen not through erasing his past but through allowing his present actions to create a new identity that eventually became more real and more relevant than the historical accidents of his birth. In doing so, he honored both the complexity of his journey and the genuine bonds he had formed with people who had every reason to hate him but chose instead to offer him a chance. The fields still grow corn where Klaus Werner once walked behind Albert Hoffmann's tractor, learning to plant in straight rows. The barn still stands where he first slept as a prisoner, uncertain about everything except that he wanted to survive until he could return home. The farmhouse still overlooks the same landscape he gradually learned to read like a text, understanding its moods and requirements through years of careful observation. And if you stand in those fields on a quiet evening when the sun is setting and the wind is moving through the corn stalks that tower overhead, you might feel something of what Werner must have felt in his final decades: the deep satisfaction of having built something real through daily effort, the quiet pride of belonging to a place that had become genuinely home, the knowledge that he had made the right choice even if it had cost him everything he once believed defined his identity. The prisoner who refused freedom discovered that freedom was not the same thing as returning to where you came from. Sometimes freedom meant choosing to stay where you were valued, where you belonged, where you had built something worth keeping. In that understanding, Klaus Werner found a kind of liberation that no repatriation order could have granted him: the freedom to become whoever he was willing to work to be, rather than being limited to whoever history had made him.